You're listening to The Bigger Picture, a podcast that advocates for human rights and addresses contemporary issues in our world. My name is Rayhan Bhatti, and I'm collectively here with Ali Muhammad and Tyler Junison. We're intellectual grade 11 students who desire to bring awareness to problems that aren't commonly addressed in the media. Today's episode will be regards to the water crisis in Canadian Indigenous reserves with our guest, Jenna Barnhardt. Thanks for tuning in.
Let us begin with the land acknowledgement. We are gathered on the ancestral lands and waters of all Indigenous people. We respectfully acknowledge those who walked on it, those who walk on it now, and future generations who have yet to walk upon it. We pray to the Creator for strength and wisdom that all may continue to serve as stewards of the earth. And now, for the people who are just tuning in, find somewhere comfy to sit and grab a nice snack while you enjoy this lovely episode.
All this food talk is making me so hungry. Boy, I wish I could have a snack right about now.
Today is going to be a compelling episode.
So, before we start today's episode, how about some food for thought?
Really, Rayhan? You're really bringing up food again? You know I haven't eaten anything all day.
Well, that's why you should never skip breakfast, my friend.
Just a creative phrase. How am I supposed to know your dietary habits? Anyways, take a moment to ponder on this statement. Imagine residing in one of the wealthiest nations on the planet, yet your lifestyle corresponds to the standards of a developing civilization. No necessities, no voice, and no one's there to help.
Well, unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, that's the case for the majority of Indigenous communities across Canada, especially the ones up north. As a matter of fact, the inadequate supply of safe drinking water is our topic of discussion in today's episode. And to quote Thomas King, he says, "What are we, entertainment?" This quote is really significant because it conveys a really important issue in today's society. A lot of Indigenous people are going through many problems, yet we are still ignoring them. Indigenous people are treated as if they were just a part of Canada and now they have their own life without any problems. And so let's get into the issue that is severely damaging their communities, the water crisis.
And this time I'm actually here, so you can't leave me out of this episode like the last one.
No one's going to be left out today. Now back to the discussion. For decades, Indigenous communities have been unable to safely make use of federal water supplies as they are heavily contaminated and ultimately not safe to use. Over the recent years, the Canadian government has done the bare minimum to aid with this issue, nor has this crisis been recently addressed by media groups. The reserves are 90% more likely to be without running water and 26 times more likely to have waterborne diseases. This is by far the most substantial deprivation to human rights in Canadian history.
So I came across an article from The Guardian that was published on the 25th of January last year. The article talks with regards to a current water crisis in Curve Lake. If you don't know, Curve Lake is an Indigenous reserve that is a few miles north of Peterborough, Ontario. Uniquely, its geographical location is surrounded by three bodies of water. Although Curve Lake is geographically privileged, these waters are contaminated with heavy metals and waterborne diseases, and so residents are still unable to utilize it due to the lack of maintenance in their water irrigation systems. Thus, they've been relying heavily on expensive bottled water shipments to use for drinking, cooking, and any other daily necessities for whatever they need water to use. And so, what is your take on this situation, Rehan?
Indeed, Ali, the points you stated are factual. Residents of Curve Lake are forced to buy shipments of bottled water to their reserve, as it is almost unquantifiable that they aren't able to use the water in their location. As a matter of fact, the bottled water expenses on Curve Lake nearly breaks even with the net income on the reserve. Likewise, the chief of Curve Lake, Emily Watung, along with many Indigenous leaders in Northern Ontario, have consequently filed a national lawsuit against the federal government for failing to meet ends with essential human rights. I believe the $2.1 billion lawsuit is expected to cover the costs associated with years of bottled water and to build a water treatment facility. In the article, Emily Watung states that the federal government promised to aid this crisis by 2020. Guys, it's 2022. The government barely reached 50% of their goal, and so she believes it is the government's due diligence to resolve this issue in monetary terms. What are your thoughts on this?
In addition to what you just said, Rehan, let's also examine the promises of our politicians, such as our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who failed to reach his electoral promise to end boil water advisories several times. As a leader of this nation, it's kind of upsetting that he did not primarily focus on solving this crisis in office. He specifically said that this problem would be addressed as a top priority because, oh, it's not right in a country like Canada. Well, that quote unquote top priority was abandoned in October 2020 when the government admitted that they would not make the mark. Trudeau keeps stretching out the date of the time it will take to put an end to all water advisories and to provide clean and fresh water for the people of the Indigenous community. At first, he promised to resolve this issue by 2021, back during his 2015 campaign, but that obviously didn't work out, so he made another promise to end the issue by 2023, and now again by 2026. At this point, it's starting to look like this plan is dead in the water.
Haha, that's funny. You know, Tyler, I found an online source written by the Council of Canadians. It is essentially a nonprofit organization that advocates for different human rights and strives for democracy. Many of the issues they discuss include the lack of clean water, free public health care, green energy, and much more. Anyways, I found an article on the website from April 2021 that talks about how the lack of safe drinking water in indigenous communities is actually one of, if not the greatest, violation of human rights that is recognized by the United Nations. Yes, the UN even declared that the Canadian government is not committing to this huge issue as they should, and is statistically being proven as 33 indigenous communities still rely on boiled water advisories and expensive bottled water shipments.
Alright, folks, now this brings us to our brand new segment, Unheard Voices. In this segment, we invite guests onto our podcast to join us for a short interview with regards to their opinion and knowledge on contemporary issues. Today's segment will be featuring our guest, Jenna Barnhardt. Welcome back to Unheard Voices, a segment in our podcast, The Bigger Picture. I'm your host, Rehan Bhatti, here with our special guest, Jenna Barnhardt. Jenna has a background in biomedical sciences and minored in psychology. She's actively part of the Indigenous student community at Ryerson University, as well as the Executive Diversity Coordinator for the Indigenous Student Association, and a peer support volunteer at the Ryerson Aboriginal Student Services. Jenna, I also heard you're a master's student. Do you mind elaborating on that and telling us a little bit more about yourself and your background?
Sure. I am currently a master's student in my second year at York University. I am doing clinical developmental neuropsychology, um, and uh, I am from a reserve called Tyendinaga, Mohawk Territory. This is part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of Iroquois, um, Iroquois Nation, Mohawk Nation. I was born and raised there. I am a member of the Turtle Clan on my reservation. And what else? I'm still actively a part of Ryerson's um, Sci Exchange program with Dr. Emily Agard as the one of the Indigenous, I guess, research assistants, or I don't really have a formal title, but it used to be student outreach um, for Indigenous science outreach. But since I'm not a student anymore, I just at Ryerson anyway. I don't know if that title is still relevant, but we'll call me that. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for introducing yourself. So, I've been doing some research with regards to contemporary issues within the Indigenous community, and I found that the water crisis is still a common problem. So, I was wondering, what do you know about this issue and why do you think it's an important topic to discuss?
Well, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. It's an important issue when you don't have access to clean water. Um, I don't know too much about other reservations outside of my own, but I know that Tyendinaga didn't have water until very, very recently. Um, and when I was growing up, we had to purchase water and have the water delivered to our house in like a holding tank. We also had a well water when I was younger, but it wasn't safe, um, obviously. So we ended up purchasing water. And I really just thought that was normal. And I do know now that I'm older that a lot of reservations still don't have access to water, like proper, like what we know here in the city is like our sewer systems and things like that. Um, we don't have that. And often I know a lot of them rely on well water, which can generally be contaminated, unsafe to consume. Sometimes it's brown, remember, like coming out of the taps, it can be even discolored and just really gross looking. So I know that that's kind of the situation that our a lot of our reservations are still facing.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate how, as discussed previously in our podcast, that we live in one of the wealthiest nations on the planet, yet the standard of living on the reserves corresponds with a developing civilization. And so, do you know of anyone else who was impacted by this issue, or do you only remember your family being affected?
No, I know that our entire reservation, which isn't very big, it's about maybe 200 or so kilometers east of Toronto. And I know that our entire reservation was the same. Um, some of us did resort to purchasing water, but I don't, as far as I know, I don't think anybody had access to clean water unless they were purchasing it from outside sources. And I do know that a lot of more than northern communities also experience the same issues. I believe growing up, Ganawage also is another Mohawk nation that's east of the city. I believe they never had access to water as well. So a lot of my indigenous kin, especially from the Mohawk Nation, Ganawage, Akwesasne, places like that, I don't think that they had. I think they were in the same situation as us. Um, but otherwise, yeah, other than that, I don't know. Um, I knew it was a problem, but I can't give you like specifically my experience outside of my own nation. No.
No problem. So, I've been doing some more research on this topic, and studies from the past 5 years show that waters on the reserves are contaminated with heavy metals, oil spills, and in particular, E. coli. So, how is your reserve able to circumvent from this issue?
Um, well, at the time, like I mentioned, we would just buy water. So we'd have to buy the closest city to our reservation is Belleville. Um, and we'd have to buy water to be actually driven in like a big truck and felt like a tank that was underground beside our house would need to be filled up. Um, and I remember when we were younger, we had like a little buzzer in our house that would go off when the tank was getting low. So we had to call and like get them to fill it up again of fresh water. Um, Prior to that, it was the well, and we were never allowed to drink it, but we always had one of those, like, you know, those water tanks that you have in like offices and stuff. Yeah, we had one of those in our house to like circumvent like the water issue. So we had that. And now now we have full sewage and like a sewage system down there right now, which is very, very recent. Like I want to say within the last 5 years or so. And that water is safe to consume. So we don't have to do any more of that other stuff now. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Now, with that being said, is there anything else you would like to leave us off with regards to the water crisis or any other problem within the Indigenous community?
Um, I just think I just hope that people are like with things like this that you guys are doing, people just have more awareness that this is going on and it's not acceptable. And for people who are struggling, like low income families and things like that, um, it's a lot of strain to have to worry about buying water. I remember growing up, we had to be very conscientious about our water use because of that. And I just hope more people will, be aware and, keep communicating to our governments and trying to make change where we can. I mean, I can be thankful enough that it actually happened on my community and we eventually got it. But I mean, growing up, I never had that. So um, yeah, I can only hope that by doing things like this, we can spread awareness and make people aware that it's a very serious issue and not having water, like you said in the beginning, in such a wealthy nation is completely unacceptable. Yeah.
Mhm. So, with that being said, thank you for your time. And that concludes our segment, Unheard Voices.
Great. Thanks for having me.
That was a great interview. And before we continue on with our podcast, I want to thank Jenna for taking some time to provide us and the audience with some highly insightful first-hand information on the water crisis. I'm happy to hear that her reserve received some aid with the issue and that it isn't a problem for her family anymore. However, she did note on the fact that this is still a contemporary issue in the Indigenous community and that the problem hasn't been fully resolved.
Additionally, Rehan, I took a look at Cengage and found that the water crisis is actually so severe that Indigenous residents had to resort to evacuating the reserves. In northwestern Ontario reserves, residents had no option but to leave because of the high amount of, I think it was hydrocarbons. Yeah, the high amount of hydrocarbons in the water, and that made the water supply undrinkable. 230 people had to evacuate from the area to Thunder Bay. Thunder Bay is 430 kilometers away from the reserve. That's insane. So they had to abandon their home. Another place that had to be evacuated is Neskantega for having bad pipes releasing oily sheens into the water. As a result, Neskantega has had a boil water advisory for 25 years.
You're right about the hydrocarbon being the cause of the contamination in the water supply. But Tyler, do you even know what a hydrocarbon is?
I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's a carbon that's a wet.
Not quite, my friend. It's actually an organic compound that is made up of two single elements. It's made up of aqueous carbon ions and hydrogen ions. The carbon atoms bond together to form the molecular structure or the framework of the molecule, while the hydrogen atoms just form all shapes and configurations inside.
I had it right? I was in the chemistry lab.
You were in a different province, but yeah, you were in a chemistry lab.
Okay, enough chemistry, Ali. Let's get back to the point. So, how do hydrocarbons contaminate fresh waters?
Well, you see, hydrocarbons come in many formations to create compounds such as methane, propane, and other gases and emissions that are used daily. They carry large quantities of petroleum, pesticides, and other harmful organic substances that can rapidly pollute water. To add on to that, pipe leaks, oil spills, and improper waste disposal are factors that pollute waters with hydrocarbons. When these hydrocarbons enter the water, it makes it undrinkable due to it being really toxic to the human body. You see, when hydrocarbons are digested, it can produce pneumonia like conditions where your lungs get irreversibly damaged. And in occasional cases, it can even lead to death. I think you can now guess why having hydrocarbons in your water supply is actually a pretty big deal. Indigenous communities right now are literally struggling to find something that is so essential as water. Now that they don't have access to this important resource, they are forced to evacuate and abandon their homes. Their lives have been completely flipped, and not in a good way, of course. There was this senior CBC reporter. I think her name is Jodie Porter. Get it? CBC reporter and Jodie Porter rhymes. All right. Anyway, so Jodie Porter was investigating a water crisis issue in Niskantaga, and from her investigation, she quotes Peter Muniz used to be the chief of Niskantaga. Today, he's one of the elders who had to leave this week when the water power plant shut down and faced the increased risk of COVID 19 outside his community. This quote is important because it describes briefly what a chief, a leader in his community, had to go through. Mr. Muniz had to abandon his home, his people, his land, because the Canadian government did not put in the effort that was required of them to give the community of Niskantaga a basic necessity and human right. And what we can learn from this matter at hand is that to never take anything for granted, no matter how small you think or how habitualized it has become in your life.
That's true, Ali. We all should be grateful for having access to such an important resource. You know, instead of pouring that glass of water down the drain with no hesitation whatsoever, we should start being more conscious with our water usage. Correspondingly, there was an identical issue that I researched about from an article by Global News with regards to the health impacts from using deficient municipal waters and the causes of water contamination on the reserves. Notably, this contemporary water crisis has been so systemic that even the residents on Curve Lake and Grassy Narrows believe there's no point at reporting the issue as the government essentially ignores having to deal with the problem.
Really now, that's insane to see that discrimination reached a point where people are not even getting help for basic certain human rights.
Yes, Tyler, and as aforementioned, the majority of these waters are contaminated with concentrations of heavy metals, waterborne diseases, and toxic contaminants. In particular, E. coli has been identified in the majority of these waters as it is presumed that these impurities are the negligence of the federal authorized industries, oil pipes, and unmaintained filtration systems. Moreover, E. coli is a highly contagious bacteria that causes intestinal damage and skin deformities by drinking contaminated water or utilizing it in your daily necessities. As a matter of fact, these diseases can be easily transmitted through aquatic organisms or could potentially be heavily concentrated in wild sea life. Emily Watung, chief of Curve Lake, was also interviewed with regards to the polluted waters and explains that many residents have gotten ill from the consumption of these waters. In fact, her family has also been impacted by the issue. In recent years, Northern Ontario has seen a drastic increase in poisoned sea life, causing limitations in fishing, which is a staple diet in the Indigenous lifestyle. Now hear this. The chief of Curve Lake had also explained that she went out with her family for dinner and ended up coming home positive for E. coli from the seafood she ate.
Excuse me, may I please have some fresh lobster with a side of food poisoning? I'll pass no oysters today. I've consumed enough heavy metals already.
Very funny, Tyler, but it is true. Given the fact that there's insufficient supplies of fresh water as well as poor living standards on the reserves, it is evident that this leads to waterborne illnesses, eczema, and cellulitis, in fact, E. coli as well. Not to mention that even physicians on the reserve say that it is very common for patients to visit them with illnesses due to the contaminated waters. But I've been doing some more research on the University of Saskatchewan's medical portal, and it is statistically shown in 16 studies that common ailments of poor drinking water can also result in gastrointestinal illnesses, skin problems, birth defects, and potentially death. Now, for those who are listening, consider the following. If POP is commonly used as an alternative for water on the reserves, because of how inexpensive it is in comparison of cost, then how do you expect residents to live a healthy lifestyle and sustain proper health conditions? It makes no sense. The government is essentially forcing residents to rely on junk food as an alternative for an essential human right, and without a doubt, this obviously contributes to the reason why there's a high rate of obesity, diabetes, neurological problems, cancer, stress, heart disease, liver and kidney problems, and even thyroid conditions.
You know, Rayhan, this whole thing reminds me of a certain quote by Thomas King. I think it was something like this. The Aboriginal people, I was told, were failing. They were dying off at such a rate that they wouldn't last another decade. I believe this has something to do with the problem. There have undoubtedly been many indigenous people who have died as a result of this water crisis, possibly due to a lack of access to necessary essentials. And if this problem is not resolved, then more individuals will without doubt become ill or die. And not to add, when you consider how much the indigenous people who have already been through in history, this problem becomes even worse. Let's only hope we can provide them with some fresh, clean water as soon as possible to limit the damage.
Take a listen at this short clip by the Human Rights Watch regarding Indigenous families at risk from the water crisis.
You would give him all kinds of medication, and I would continually bathe him in that water. But after a while, I noticed that he was getting infections all the time, and I would continually be at the doctor's office. And finally, one day when I took him in, he asked me, he said, is your water treated at home? And I said, no. And I told him, I said that our water comes directly from the lake, I said, into our homes, and that we don't have a treatment plant. He said, there's your problem. He said, it's your water. He said, that's why your boy keeps getting these infections.
It is very heartbreaking, actually, to see a young boy unable to cleanse himself because the water in his community contains impurities. It caused irritations to his skin, and his mother had to take him to the doctor several times. Contaminated water like the one in the clip has affected the lifestyle of many people in indigenous communities. With regards to the aspect of health and wellness, the communities are constantly fighting waterborne diseases and skin diseases transmitted through filthy water. Contaminated waters don't just affect their health, it also affects their finances. Think about it. Indigenous people have to purchase bottled water every day or so in order to stay hydrated and keep breathing. Also, frequent visits to the doctor don't come cheap. Even if they have free healthcare, they have to pay for the transportation and the medications. A quote by the Auditor General of Canada states that the prevalence of drinking water advisories in Indigenous communities in Canada is a national disgrace that clearly results in myriad consequences that are particularly problematic for an already marginalized and disadvantaged group. So, the significance of this quote to the clip is that it describes what has become of Canada and what the superior Canadians keep on getting. They get more and more stuff, and they have such luxurious lives, while Indigenous communities are overlooked and ignored over a simple yet important resource. Water to our body is like gasoline to a car. Without water, the body won't be able to navigate very far, but if it is contaminated, it can destroy the car.
So, to wrap everything said in today's podcast, the water crisis has been a major issue revolving around the indigenous community for decades. While specific factors leading to this issue vary for each individual community, studies from the University of Windsor identified that a variety of systemic problems contributed to the persistent crisis. The problem partially exists due to the legacy of colonization and forced habitual relocation to places with insufficient or inaccessible water supplies. You know, this kind of reminds me of my analysis of Thomas King's lectures, The Truth About Stories, and Drew Hayden Taylor's play, Alternatives, in which I've seen that both writers persuade the idea for a change in societal ethics towards this marginalized group. And this is done in a way by highlighting follies in history or talking about how the colonial bias altered the moral beliefs of the general public. Thus, it is unfortunate that these contemporary circumstances garner unique challenges from the impact of our colonial past. As a result, the indigenous community has been practically thrown under the bus, leaving them to deprive themselves of aging filtration and distribution systems, insufficient funding, as well as an inequitable lifestyle. Overall, these government run systems are in fact more vulnerable to contamination and outbreaks compared to regular municipal systems.
Exactly, Rehan. I certainly agree. In 2016, the government allocated more than $2 billion to improve water and wastewater systems in First Nation communities, including funding to operate and maintain public drinking water systems. This is not enough though, because the problem still exists. It helped, but not enough, because people still cannot get clean tap water and still have to rely on bottled water. Some might argue that they're merely even doing it just to make their political party appear better or to cut down on press attention. The government announced almost $1.5 billion more in additional funding starting in the 2020 to 2021 fiscal year to accelerate the work being done and to end all long-term drinking water advisories on public water systems on First Nation reserves, and an additional $114 million per year for the operation and maintenance of water and wastewater systems. Despite this effort, the issue of poor access to safe and clean drinking water in First Nation communities continues. 119 of these long-term drinking water advisories has been eliminated, but 43 remain in effect in 31 First Nation communities. This means progress is happening, but it's still not enough.
I believe that if the Canadian government would just turn some of their focus a little bit more, we would be seeing progress actively happening. We could soon be tackling this major issue inside Canada's Indigenous communities.
Exactly. All in all, the water crisis in Canadian Indigenous communities reflects the unresolved and unaccounted issues related to their justice, inequity, and trends in federal responsibility that have resulted in the interference of Indigenous sovereignty, culture, and spiritual health. Thus, issues like this shouldn't be left alone. Our society needs to make efforts to ensure the government puts more monetary focus on investing for more water and wastewater infrastructures to sustainably source clean drinking water on the reserves. Take a moment to reflect on this quote by Michael Curlew, a physician who works with Indigenous patients. Canadians need to look in the mirror and reflect on how their belief systems have been shaped by colonization. And this quote is true. It is devastating how the colonial system has disregarded the lives of the Indigenous community. Society fails to provide a complete understanding of the contemporary issue, as it is not being addressed nor advocated by the government or media. Our main goal as Canadians is to aid this issue and get it out to the general public. As a matter of fact, I was looking into a charitable organization, Water First Canada, and it is a great example of how you can help. Water First is one of the top charitable organizations in Canada addressing water challenges in the Indigenous communities through education, training, and meaningful collaboration. They work together with Indigenous communities to build, operate, and research on water treatment facilities, as well as sustainable ways to purify water on the reserves. I highly recommend donating to this organization as they're doing a great job at helping this issue.
On behalf of all members of the Bigger Picture podcast, this is a call to action, a call for change, and a reason for you to help.
And as Langston Hughes once said, I dream a world where no other man will scorn, where love will bless the earth and peace its paths adorn. I dream a world where all will know sweet freedom's way, where greed no longer saps the soul, nor avarice blights our day. A world I dream where black or white, whatever race he be, will share the bounties of earth, where every man is free, where wretchedness will hang its head, and joy, like a pearl, attends the needs of all mankind. Of such I dream my world. Thank you.
And on that note, thank you so much for tuning into the Bigger Picture. Make sure to check out waterfirst.ngo for more information on how to help with the water crisis. And as always, think big, stay humble, and make the world a better place.